Okay, so let's talk about giving. Why is giving important? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to dispel why it's not important. And here's the logic: is giving is a way of releasing ourselves from the holds of the world. What it's meant to do fundamentally is it's meant to be an act of worship first and foremost, which means that it's meant to be an acknowledgement of God's presence in us and over us. And so when we think about giving as a way to actually promote the world or to get something done, then what we've done is we've actually corrupted the whole process to begin with. So if we understand that piece, then we can move on to the next piece and understand why giving is so perhaps difficult for people to get a hold of today. Jesus spent more time on the issue of treasures and what to do with them than on any other issue, because he realized that in our own insecurity, this is what we revert to, is we revert to the hold of something in the world upon us. Now, there's basically three parts of our being: our body, our soul, and our spirit. So our body has to do with our feelings, motor sensations, sight, sound, etc., etc. Our soul has to do with our emotions, and our spirit has to do with the eternal substance of which we're comprised. So when we deal with how it is that we're negotiating giving, we're first of all trying to negotiate between our feelings and our faith. And our fears, which is where our soul or our emotions are, is what kind of translates it. It'll decide which way we're going to go. Are we going to go toward our feelings or toward the material side? Or are we going to be submitted to the faith, the assurance of things hoped for, the certainty of things unseen? This is why giving is so liberating, is it actually confronts our feelings, which is just our limited perspective. We can only feel what's around us. And it then lets us apply into something that's eternal, which is much bigger than us, much wider, much deeper, much stronger. And so when we look at giving, what we have to do is we have to first of all recognize that it's about the liberty from our feelings and the submission of our fears, and its practice is meant to discipline the world that has a hold of us first and foremost. Okay, so now with that being said, the reason why Jesus then in the New Testament had the context of giving changed from bringing it to the temple and laying it at the apostles' feet was because the apostle was an agent who had reconciled himself outside of the world, whereas the temple, being promoted by Herod, was a sellout organization that basically was in league with pagan Rome, and it was exploiting the people in Jerusalem. And it needed to be confronted and it needed to be destroyed because it was fundamentally promoting the world rather than challenging it or rather than disciplining it. So Jesus said, I came to destroy the temple. I came also to fulfill the law. He was trying to liberate people from the subjection to the world, and he did so right at the money changers table, where he tipped it over to expose that this was the problem that was causing everybody in the area of Judea to become basically suppressed or oppressed by both Rome and what they trusted as their religion, which was the temple. This was complex. It was problematic. It needed somebody to go in and basically kick butt and take names, and that's what Jesus did on what I call the most holy day of all Scripture, or Kick-Ass Monday. So that was the day after Palm Sunday. That's where he goes in and he upstarts the temple. And what he did is he actually looked at how to liberate the body from the subjection of both the government, which will always look to suppress people for its own sake, but also too then the false religious society, which will then always look to be in league to try to gain power over others. I like to say it's paper, rock, scissors. Paper, government, covers rock. Okay, rock, okay, religious society crushes scissors. Scissors, when it's unified, will actually cut the paper. So if people are liberated and are unified, in particular in their giving, not only do they then cut the government, but then they also become a faith that's sincere. So with that being said, let's talk about the 4 different kinds of applications of giving. First one, when we look at the church as it was comprised in America, has to do with legitimate participation. The church is meant to be an all-volunteer organization. It doesn't meant to have any kind of paid staff. And that was so that it was able to be operated entirely in charity, which means love or self-sacrifice, and administered in poverty, which means giving without expectation of return. This is the way that value is meant to be developed in our country. So charity, sacrifice, voluntarily extended, done so mutually within a community or location, locale. So the idea of a local church is to facilitate voluntary contribution freely administered within inside of a local community. That was basically looking at saying that we're not going to be submitted to the Pope or the Catholic essentially hierarchy, and we're not going to be submitted to England, the one that was trying to replace the Pope. What we're going to do is be submitted to the location of people that have a mutual faith, and that was the ecclesia. Now, the idea of, first of all, participation is translated today as basically being able to give something into a church offering plate. And what I would say is that when people come to church services, they're receiving the service of being able to worship God in a way that is like them. All right, whatever extent that is done for them, it's a service for them to be able to worship God in the composition of their gifts, whether that's just singing or whether that's something else. That is a service that's being rendered to them, and the professionals that do that are basically somebody who's doing something inside of the world as a service to others. We should not deny them anything. And the idea that that is a way that we give is kind of missing the point of a voluntary and mutual contribution. All right, so the offering money that we put in, and again, it's given kind of a sliding scale. If you use a tithe or if you use a free contribution, is meant to be able to be freely given, but there's no way that we should be chincing the administrators of that because they're offering a service for us. To do so is just basically stealing or being fundamentally irresponsible with respect to our fellow man. And so that is a problem today because people imagine that their contribution into the service, which is serving them, is actually giving when it's really just not stealing. Okay? So first of all, participation is making sure that we're doing our part and that what we're doing is that whether it's money, time, or our talents, that we're actually giving worship to God freely and we're doing so mutually within inside the composition of everyone else around us. That's number one. Number two is tithe. A tithe is a way that we were given inside the church to be able to contend with the objective of taxes. It's a way to actually be able to develop a community support or a community response to the needs. Now, the tithe and the theocracy of the Jewish community had 6 very specific functions. It had to do with celebrations. It had to do with maintaining the priests or the administrators. It had to do with being able to help people who were in need inside the community. It had to do with then taking care of widows and orphans who were really created because their dads went out and went to fight the pagan bad guys in the world. I mean, it's kind of like a military. And so it would create orphans and widows by virtue of that. So it's kind of like a way to take care of your veterans. And then finally, it would be able to take care of the aliens. So it would be kind of an immigrant thing. So when we look at the tithe is supposed to function to be able to maintain those values within inside of the community and to do so by choice. If we don't tithe, then we will be taxed. And that is basically saying, well, you know, you haven't done it by choice, so what we got to do is we got to do it by force. Okay, so the tithe is a way to contend with the government's objective of taxing and to make sure that the economy stays local. I've even advocated right now because churches technically are not what you would call local churches anymore. They're essentially either non-for-profits or religious societies. And the distinguishment is that the local church would be everybody in the community. So maybe you would see it in a small town, but churches were meant to be, you know, between 200 or 1,000 people. The Greeks didn't believe that you could actually function a democracy, which is what the church really is, in more than 1,000 people. So when we have larger towns and bigger cities, we run into a natural problem that then falls into cultural division or denominations. So when we look at churches, I've thought that one of the ways to try to regain the value of being able to take the local community and have them address the issues in their area that have to do with aliens or immigrants, and have to do with your veterans, and have to do with your community celebrations, and have to do with the community needs, is to have the churches actually tied to your local government. Now, that sounds radical, but if you think about it, the church is the only thing in our country that's given the essentially power to administer values. And so teaching the tithe is what is the station of the church. And if the churches then contributed to the local government, as they should be doing, by virtue of what they are, then what they would do is reestablish the credibility of actually teaching the tithe. That would then cut the need to have the government administer it by force, aka taxes, which is entirely inefficient. So that one move of increasing the tithe by actually increasing participation in local churches that actually would then contribute to the local communities could become one of the most strategic ways that we could help to address the needs that we see around us today. And again, the way that we would contend with the things like the low labor cost of China and India and other smaller levels of human compensation is with the church, which can administer time and talents freely, about as cheap an economy as you can get inside of a local area, and also two treasures to be able to help meet the needs within the community. And then, in other words, it's kind of our ace in the hole if you think about it from an organizational or business standpoint. What I'm saying is that to not give tithes to the churches is economically insane from a holistic standpoint. Now, if you're a corporate guy and you're trying to exploit people and try to take 50% of their energy revenue and use it for your own gain, then that doesn't make sense, obviously. But if you're actually a real person and you understand that a corporation is not a person, that really a person is a person, a corporation is a gang of guys that are ganging up on a person, then what you realize is that the smartest move is actually to give tithes to the churches, because they're local institutions that then can actually teach the value of mutual sacrifice, which is an economy in and of itself. Right? So that's number 2, participation, right? Administration of the services. Number 2, helping the community by choice through tithes. Okay? Number 3, giving or offerings. Offerings had to do with your apostles. Now, the only context in the New Testament of actual real giving is laying at the apostles' feet. Why is that? It's not because of a hierarchy. It's not because the apostle is meant to be above. In fact, it's the role that's below everyone. It descends down into becoming smaller than everyone else. The apostle is an outcast. The apostle is somebody who's rejected. He'll say something and it will frustrate everybody. They'll get all riled up because, oh my gosh, listen to what he says. And what they'll do is react to it because he is obliged to God first and foremost. Therefore, what happens is that he establishes or she establishes themselves as being outcast. Paul said to the Corinthians, I'm surely an apostle to you. I'm an outcast to you. And he was dealing with their issues of hospitality, which they were not really being very, very conscious about him and what he was doing. And so he's kind of like making fun of them, and their immaturity and their irresponsibility. So when you have somebody who is a minister who then functions and creates a body of people inside of a community, it helps organize that, which is essentially a charitable business. Again, busyness just has to do with people's activity, and does so for the composition of God's economy of love. In other words, everyone's being willing to sacrifice themselves. That is a much higher value than any business can even put together inside of a community. That's not the body of Christ. That's a function of work. And so when we look at that apostle or planter or person who is outside of the system, which the ministers in America in the churches were given the context to be in, then what we do is that we need to understand that that is the way that we then give offerings unto the Lord. That is actually the real form of worship, because it's separate from the institutions that then govern the world. Maybe it's a little bit contrived because your churches are actually organizations, and really the body of Christ is meant to operate inside of connection, pseudomenoi, or inside of koinonia. But it also is a means by which that we protect the body of Christ today. And it's kind of like if we don't protect that sanctuary, then we'll lose it. And the only alternative to losing the church today is really a context of socialism, because we don't have a pope or king governing our values. What that means is that then the government by force will then govern equity as an issue, and will not really have a choice in that. We'll do so by the choice of actually diminishing this protective role that the church plays for the body of Christ and for others if we miss giving rightly unto the Lord. The last context of giving has to do with alms, and that has to do with not turning away somebody who comes to your door. That has to do with a person who's poor, or a person who's in need, or a person who just comes to your door and needs a little bit of help. It's personal responsibility for the economy of God. So what you do with that is that you set a little bit of aside so to make sure that if somebody comes to your door, you have something to offer. Now, what I've tried to, encourage people to do is to see a very, very simple structure. And I'm going to encourage this as a way to challenge how we administer the resources that are entrusted to us financially. Okay? And what it is, it's a very, very simple 10% context of how to set aside things and how to then try to govern and structure our lives to live on those kinds of administrations. Okay? The first one is, if we looked at 100% of our resources that we have, the first 10% we should give to the Lord for His work. All right, that might be a storehouse that you might have set aside inside your home to be able to take care of somebody in need, or to be able to take care of God's work. It's given unto the Lord. It's not something that really is meant to be administered by your set of values or my set of values. It's meant to be administered by the Lord's circumstance that He puts inside your life. So the first fruits would be given to God and set aside for the sake of the administration of His purposes in the world, and that could be a lot of things. All right. The second 10%, let me say, is I would suggest setting aside a savings. And what I would then offer as being responsible is to try to build up a resource that could then take care of 3 months of operations. That creates a security base. That's pretty standard within inside of any kind of financial planning seminar or structure, but it's pretty simple when you start to think about operating on less to be able to actually set aside that amount and then have that kind of resource there. The third 10% I would offer should be for the development of God's purpose in you. That would be for the purpose of your enterprise, your initiative. But if you don't invest into it, how can you expect others to? So what I would offer is that your third 10% should go toward developing your personal enterprise. Today, with a velocity-based economy, which means that it's built around human exchange and human development, and land value really isn't as valuable as we once thought it was, because basically people are not independently farming. That was the context of freedom, and independently taking care of their families that way. So freedom is not really available through land right now. Instead, freedom is available through the personal development of what a person has as their gifts and talents. And so investing into your gifts and talents, your education, furthering, developing that, is probably the wisest thing that you can do. Okay? And what I'm going to suggest that you do is you take 10% of your resources and you put it aside toward that end. All right? So that's the third 10%, is invest into what God has put into you. Take them seriously. The fourth 10% is to make sure that you're participating in setting aside resource for community support. And so that would be, essentially what you would have is tithe or taxes. Either one. If you choose to tithe, then that cuts down on your taxes. And, that is administered in advance rather than at the end, rather than being forced to have to do something. Instead, what you've done is you've been responsible. You don't need to be spanked by taxes. Instead, you're a responsible person, and you actually figure out how to help others and how to be a part of the community and not just be somebody who sucks off of it. All right, so if you do that, then what you've done is that you've kind of like made an advanced decision that you're not just somebody who's kind of exploiting everyone else for your own gain, and that's a responsible person. The next 40% would be what I would say would be operations. And whether that's operations within inside of a family, again, it works for a personal context, or whether operations within inside of a business. Both of these apply over. You could administer this same kind of administration process into a business as easily as you could with a family. But 40% is a good rule. What that means is that you're going to live on less than what you take in, by 10%. You're going to live on 40%, or you're going to operate on 40%, and that's a good principle. What that means is you have a final 20%. Now, a lot of people are just not that disciplined in dealing with consumer administrations, and so what they've done is they've either gotten into consumer debt or they don't know how to actually invest. And investment is what I would say is the greatest gift, is to be able to then invest into the extension of work, aka ministry. Again, this is a little different than giving offerings unto the Lord through the apostles' feet, which is kind of how the New Testament then administered God's kingdom and protected God's kingdom. These gifts are people who are doing good works, and ultimately, whether you look at trying to raise more revenues, which really are only valuable if you make them work for you in the context of encouraging somebody. So they're only really valuable if they're put into people. You can put them into your stock market or your storehouses or whatever, but eventually the value is going to decrease, or somebody else is going to take it and is going to spend it for you when you die. I mean, they're going to administer it, in a way that is outside the context of your choice. So while you're living, making sure that what you do is you try to do as much as you can to encourage others. Again, consider how to provoke, incite, and then encourage others to love and good deeds would be, I think, probably what a wise, what you call steward or wise minister would do. Store for yourselves treasures in heaven. There's people that are doing all sorts of things inside the world today, and really that last 20%, once you take care of your debt liabilities, would then be a way to show that you are blessed. In other words, that you are somebody who responsibly has dealt with your finances in a way that then enables you to invest into others. So, to sum up, if you deal with how to give, all right, participation into a church is just doing your part. Tithe is just being a part of the community, and it cuts against taxes. Offerings are how you give to the Lord, and that is at the apostles' feet, or those who are outside the context of the normal administrations of the world. And then alms are making sure that you don't turn away who God sends to your door. Then you can look at how to steward your resources, and the structure that I would offer is a 10% structure. The first 10%, give it to God, supply your storehouse, be able to not turn people away, know that you're going to be God's minister. The second 10% is making sure that you can secure yourself and you secure your family, making sure that you're able to sustain for 3 months, should things go bad at least. You don't need more than that, really, otherwise it's just wasting it. The next 10% is dealing with how you deal with your offerings, how you deal with your investment into yourself, how you then look at how you take seriously God's work in you. The next 10% is how you then deal with your taxes within the community, or your tithe within the community, making sure you're doing your part within the community. So you got those first 4 things: God, all right, family, all right, yourself, and community as being your first resources or your first distribution. Then looking at how you operate. Again, it challenges your consumption, which of course everything around wants to exploit, but you challenge then your consumption temptation through not being just pushed here and there by every whim and every emotion, all your feelings. Instead, you operate by faith, and you function on 40% of what you take in, and then the last 20%, retire your debt, and or as soon as you do, then you can invest into the opportunity to bless and extend God's kingdom through others, or extend good works through others. Again, the only differentiation I would say is that's very different than giving unto the Lord. Now what you're doing is you're expanding the tents, and what you're doing is you're trying to then build this presence on earth and the protection of this presence on earth. And hopefully that makes sense. So hopefully this is helpful and encouraging for SFI, for Set Free Initiatives. What we do is we administer resources. We serve as a sincere organization of faith, meaning that the people that are involved, I know, are sincere because of the disciplines of their life. And then what we do is we administer resources toward those targets, either toward sincere ministers, myself, my family, or others who are basically, outside of the context of the normal business world, or projects. People and projects is what we really kind of look at. And for us, what we do is we don't take administrative fees out of the resources that are meant to be contributed to people and projects. Instead, what we do is we serve that function as an act of faith, and that's how we work the ministry. And it's there so that the true nature of charity doesn't get compromised, the true nature of poverty doesn't get compromised, and the facilitation of it doesn't get compromised or doesn't get exploited. Because once you start to then have a financial benefit attached to your administration, then there's an incentive to have that administration grow or to have that administration expand, and that, in my opinion, is not responsible. So hopefully this is helpful and encouraging. If you want to contribute to people and projects, you can do so through our website. There's a little place on the side that says Give. We'll promote those every once in a while, and then you can administer resources confidently through those projects. There'll be a place through the account that will then identify that, and they'll be administered 100% to that end, whatever, minus whatever the fee is that's taken out for the mechanism. But we even try to actually cover that as well, so that people can give fully what they intend to give to people, and we kind of just embrace the liability of that. So hopefully this is helpful for you and encouraging. I do think it's in very much a contrast to what the world normally does, and I'm glad, like Paul said, to offer that. He called his position, I guess, a boast, but I think that that's something that's important to maintain a context of understanding of how to overcome the world, rather than to have the world overcome us, particularly inside the context of feelings, the material world versus our faith.